Good morning, everyone. My name's Ian MacArthur, and I'm the Director of the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter. Really pleased to be here today with Brabners, and I don't know why we say it, Mason. Is it Grtfl or is it Grtfl? Either
It
way,
is Grtfl.
it is Grtfl. Grtfl without the vowels. So really pleased to be here with you today to talk about what is, I think, a really timely webinar. If you follow the news, you'll appreciate that yesterday the new Code of Practice was published for the Allocation of Tips Act. Also a piece of news yesterday that the legislation which was supposed to come in, I think, into July, will now come in on the 1st of October, which gives everyone a little bit longer to comply. Now, this is an important issue. Goodness, hospitality industry and the service industry have had a tumultuous last 4 years. COVID has severely impacted the industry, and then cost of living, utility prices, etc., all seen pressures placed on the hospitality sector. COVID particularly saw us move largely to a cashless approach, and that probably impacted on tipping during that period. So quite an interesting range of dynamics that have gone on over the last 4 years. So really timely, really interesting, and great to have such expertise with us with Lee and Mason today. We've got the Good Employment Charter has been running since 2019, and it's there to help support employers across all industries on how we can develop best employment across the city region. But first, let's just do a little bit about housekeeping. Let's go back, sorry. The webinar will be recorded. All participants will be muted during the webinar. And if you've got a question for the panelists, please, if you can just type it into the question box on the right-hand side, you'll see on the screen highlighted in red. If you pop your question in there, that will come to me and I'll be able to ask it to Lee and to Mason as we come to the end of the webinar. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Charter. Then Lee will talk about the legal aspects, and then Mason will talk about the practical insights about how employers can deal with this issue and deal with the challenges it presents. We'll move to questions, and then we'll wrap up within the hour. Again, let's just look at Lee. Lee, a partner at Brabners, handles complex HR issues and has been a supporter of the Good Employment Charter almost from day one, Lee, particularly around flexible work, predictable hours, contracts recently, and has got a specialist interest in the hospitality sector. So really great to have you here, Lee, with that background. Mason is co-founder of Grtfl, a cashless tipping and trunk platform, and we'll hear more from Mason about what that means and how that sort of technology can help approach the issues that we're facing with the new Act. Just very briefly, the Good Employment Charter, as I said, set out in 2019, established to raise standards across all sectors in Greater Manchester, all sectors, sizes and geography, looking to improve employment standards. We look at 7 characteristics. We look specifically at pay, and the real living wage is the standard by which we look at an employer to see whether they're paying at the right level. We also look at pay gaps, etc. But be interesting to see and learn today about how tips pay into that particular criteria. We also deal with secure work, flexible work, engagement and voice, good management, health and well-being and recruitment, all of which add up to good employment in our eyes. To become a member of the Charter, you start as a supporter, and you would sign up at our website, and that gives you access to a network of like-minded employers, a whole range of events, explore days, share and learns, webinars like this, and other events across the year. Increasingly, it's an important thing to give your employees and potential employees a visible commitment towards good employment. We're seeing increasingly in these times of difficult retention and recruitment experiences that the Good Employment Charter mark actually sets you apart in what is increasingly tough employment market. We also provide access to resources like webinars today, but also a whole range of resources that otherwise you'd probably find behind a paywall, things like CIPD, ACAS resources, etc. And we know that, as the quote from Professor Carrie Cooper says on the left-hand side, good work increases performance, and at times when we're all looking for marginal gains, good employment practice will lead to performance improvement and increased productivity. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Lee Jeffcott from Brabners, who's going to talk us through the legislation that is all coming our way. Thanks, Lee.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Ian. And it's good to be here today to talk about what's increasingly becoming my favourite subject, the Allocation of Tips Act 2023. You can tell by the name that the legislation actually came into force last May, but it's not actually been brought into force yet by Parliament. So it's kind of there on the statute book and everyone's kind of talking about it, but it's still not actually quite yet in force. What we've had is the government published a code of practice, as they tend to do with new legislation these days, and setting out a lot more meat on the bone about how businesses and employers and organisations should deal with things. And that draft, timing is everything, because the draft was kind of finalised yesterday, the day before our webinar. And the main thing to note is that you'll still see out there online everyone saying that the legislation is coming in on the 1st of July 2024, and it's actually now been put back to the 1st of October to allow businesses more time to get to grips with what's required, change their systems, their payroll systems, subscribe to an app or whatever you want to do to comply with the new requirements. So we've got a bit more time, but the 1st of October will come around quicker than we know. So let me just, so basically the main reason the act has come into force is to prevent exploitative practices. So, you know, we all see kind of headlines of, you know, some businesses who have been named and shamed, where ultimately the money that customers leave in good faith to go to the staff are essentially being used for other purposes. So things like, you know, being used to top up wages. You know, that's, in my experience, acting for some employers in the sector is not uncommon, and people still do that. They'll use the money for, you know, bank charges, admin expenses. They might keep the money for a long period of time to what they call smooth over tips. So, you know, the staff actually eventually get them, but they've got to wait a long time for them. To prevent exploitative practices is the sort of key thing, really. You know, most good employers will be passing over tips, and it won't be an issue. But there are some poor practices out there, and this is designed to kind of stop that. The government's press release yesterday kind of says that more than 2 million workers will be receiving tips. So there's a lot. I mean, this is a big industry, and you've got 2 million workers in the sector. Some of whom have, you know, are not benefiting from tips. There was, to support the code of practice, there's been a government consultation on this, and 159 respondents replied. So we've got industry groups, UK hospitality, we've got industry sector providers, we've got groups of employees, trade unions, but also a lot of operators, a lot of hospitality operators have replied to the consultation. And interesting to have a look through, because even though a decent percentage of employees report that their employer does pass on all of the tips and service charges, about 11% said that they didn't. And I thought that was quite a lot. Still poor practice out there. So the sort of nuts and bolts of all of this is that we're going to so there'll be a requirement to pass on 100% of tips and service charges to relevant workers, so people who've worked in the business at the time of the shift. There's also going to be a big focus on increased transparency, because the other big factor here is that a lot of workers haven't really known about how their tips and service charges are paid to them. So they'll see something in their paycheck at the end of every month or every other month, but ultimately they won't see exactly how it's been calculated. A lot of people have been in the dark over this. So increased transparency, we'll talk about that shortly. If you get this wrong as a business, then we've got employment tribunals having the jurisdiction to order employers to revise an allocation, so redo the tips, make recommendations and order payments. So for people who are not complying with this after the 1st of October, there is the prospect of being taken to an employment tribunal for these failures. Again, not somewhere where employers want to be. So just moving into kind of a bit more of the nitty-gritty. So these new requirements are going to apply to what's called qualifying tips, gratuities, and service charges. So the most obvious example is when you go to a restaurant and you pay your bill, you usually tap with your card, and the restaurant quite often would add on a 12% service charge, 12.5%, 10%, whatever it is, and that money obviously goes pretty much always straight into the employer's bank account. So that would be an employer received tip, because the legislation refers to employer received tips and service charges. But of course, paying on the card is not the only way in which customers can leave a tip. And in the respondents to the survey, a decent percentage, I think it was about 30-odd% of businesses said that they still have customers leaving cash tips. So even though most people do leave tips on their credit cards or debit cards, people are still leaving cash tips. Now they will be within the legislation if the employer exercises control over them, or a significant influence, it says in the legislation. So pretty much, if the tips are collected up at the end, they're taken over to the counter, the employer then collects them and then decides how they're allocated, then they will be within the legislation as well, quite obviously. However, contrast that with a situation where the employer plays no part in the process. Then in that situation, if the workers on that shift are genuinely allowed to take the tips themselves that they receive, and if that's the practice, then the legislation doesn't apply to it, because as you see here, it only applies to employer received tips or service charges, or those that the employer exercises control over, even if they're initially received by the worker. The other thing to mention is that the draft code of practice, which was finalised yesterday, it does talk about apps. So things like Mason's app that is going to talk about, and also there are some other providers out there where they make it easy for customers to leave tips, and very often in that case the money that goes into the app will not ever go into the employer's bank account, and basically the money is received directly by the worker. So in that situation, the code of practice actually says that those apps, if they work in that way, will be outside of the new legislation. So that's quite interesting. Moving on to the kind of main show, if you like, fair allocation of tips. What's this going to look like? Well, you'll see in the first bullet point, the employer must ensure that the total amount of qualifying tips and gratuities and service charges paid or attributable to a place of business of the employer is allocated fairly between the employer's workers at that place of business. So I think the first thing to say is that the legislation is very much geared around a place of business. So if you operate multiple sites and you currently deal with tips across those sites, it's pretty clear that's not going to be compliant with the new legislation when it comes in, because it's very much geared around a place of business, which I take to mean a particular restaurant or site. So it has to be site specific. Timing wise, payment must be received by the worker no later than the end of the month after the tip was paid by the customer. So the example that's given in the code of practice is if the customer leaves a tip on the 23rd of June, the worker must receive it by no later than the 31st of July. So it's got to be paid within that time scale. If it isn't, that's when you're risking an employment tribunal claim. The use of a third-party tronc, so some businesses will use troncs to distribute the tips and to the workers. That's still going to be allowed if it's fair to do so, the legislation says. And as you'll see on the slide, the consultation closed in February, but the results of it were just published yesterday. There's also a provision about a non-public place of business. So the way I understand this is that it will be permissible to divide the tips and service charges up to people who are working in a non-customer facing area or place of business. So that could be, for example, a kitchen that's used just to prepare the food, which is then moved to a restaurant, which then has the customers going in there. So you will be allowed to, and probably encouraged to, if you want to achieve fairness, to think about people who are also working in those non-public places of business. Turning to look at what a fair allocation might look like in the code of practice, the first thing the code of practice says is it says that, of course, you don't have to give the same percentage or proportion to everybody who's been on shift. You could decide to do that, but you don't have to. The second thing to note is that there's a lot of discretion given to the employer. So the code says that as long as the employer's applied their mind to fairness and has, looked at the factors, then they ought to be compliant with the requirements. Just looking at my notes here, so factors that you are encouraged to take into account to look at a fair allocation is the type of role that the worker is in. So again, it's quite common to split the tips charges between the front of house staff, the people who are serving, and also the people who are contributing to the service, so people who work in the kitchens and other areas. So you can and should take that into account. The type of role that people are performing. Also interesting, the basic pay. So if you have let's say, I don't know, an operations manager, restaurant or place of business, but they are pretty well paid, it may well be legitimate to exclude them from the tips because you've taken into account their basic pay, and you've decided that it's it's appropriate that they're not included. So you don't have to include everybody who's working in the place of business, and you can take into account pay. You can also take into account individual performance. So if you want to design a system which rewards individual performance, you can do that, and that's explicitly mentioned in the code. So that's a reason that tips are given for good service, and that's recognised. And also customer intention. So that's a factor that's in the code as well. So if the customer intends the particular person serving them to have the tip, then that can be taken into account. So that's just a bit of a brief look through the different factors that need to be taken into account. I mentioned at the beginning about transparency and this kind of air of mystery about tips. So the way that the legislation deals with that is that they place a requirement on the employer to have a written policy, a written tips policy, and to make it available to all workers at the place of business, so that people know how tips are going to be dealt with and how they're going to be calculated. The policy must say whether the employer requires or encourages customers to pay tips and service charges at that place of business, and it's got to say how the provisions of the Act are met, so how the tips and service charges are allocated. There's also in the Code of Practice some useful information about how you make available the written policy, and it talks about, you know, you can do it as part of a induction process for new staff. You can provide it electronically, of course you can. You know, most employers would these days. So when you ask people to sign their contracts of employment or acknowledge receipt of policies, HR policies, that would be, in my view, be an ideal place to have them check a box to say that they've read the tips policy and that they acknowledge that they received a copy of it. Other places you can, of course, you can do it old school. You could print it out and put it on the wall of the restroom, or the place where people go to have a break. But again, you've got to make sure that people are actually seeing it and they're aware of it. So people who don't go to that break room would not necessarily see it. So have a think about how you practically would make the policy, you make workers aware of the policy. The second part of transparency is to do with tipping records. So again, there'll be a new right on workers to make a written request for the employer's tipping record, and that's something new. And I think this is going to be, quite a difficult thing for employers to get used to. Okay, so whereas previously, if people have asked questions about how their tips have been calculated, I suspect in most cases it's been sort of brushed off, or perhaps they've not been given the right level of information. Whereas now, you'll see on the slide, the worker may request the following records. So the total amount of tips, service charges paid at the place of business where they've worked in that period, and also the amount allocated to them. Okay, so two numbers: the overall amount of tips and service charges, and then the amount allocated to that particular worker or ITO, the independent trunk operator. So that's information that you're going to have to change your system to be able to provide to workers. Now, they can't make a request on every single shift. So the legislation says that you can make no more than one request every 3 months. Okay. And you've got to have been a worker at the place of business at some point during that 3 months, obviously, to qualify, to be entitled to make this request. You've got to have worked there. The period covered by the request, you'll see there on the slide, 1 or more consecutive months, and it's got to begin not more than 3 years before the date of the request. So if you make a request, I don't know, a month after the legislation comes in, let's say, so at the end of October, you can ask for the information for that whole month, and as time moves on, you'll be able to ask for information covered by obviously a longer period of time, but then no more than 3 years earlier. So it's actually quite a onerous thing if you think about it, because you might have somebody in 3 years' time who comes in and asks for information covered, for the entire 3-year period. So it's not necessarily going to be so easy to comply with. So proper records. If you get a request for a tipping record, it must be provided within 4 weeks of the date of the request. And if you're not required to keep one because you're outside of the legislation, you've got to say so and explain why. Okay. Now, is there a data protection issue? Employment lawyers love data protection. Are you disclosing information about other workers? You're only entitled to receive information about your the tips that you've been allocated and the overall amount. So you don't have to. There's no right to receive information about other workers' tips. And you'll see at the bottom there's the employment tribunal piece. So if there's a failure, there can be a claim to a tribunal, and the tribunal can order you to comply and potentially order compensation as well. So are there any problem areas? One area that some of the industry bodies have been raising in this is agency workers, because the legislation does cover agency workers. So if you think about the average restaurant or bar or operation, they may well have, well, they're likely to have their own direct employees, but also they might get workers supplied by an agency, quite common. And the way things are currently drafted, agency workers have to be included in the allocation, which is a bit of a departure from how things have been so far. And the mechanism by which the agency worker gets paid the tips is a little bit unclear, if I can put it that way, because if the agency worker won't be set up on the payroll of the actual restaurant, usually they're on the payroll of the agency. So the mechanism seems to be that the employer is going to have to work out the allocation, pay it to the agency, who then pay it over without any deductions to their workers. So a little bit to be thought through there still, I think. Can the worker challenge a fair allocation? Well, they can do, but provided that the employer has a written tips policy and that they've fairly looked at the factors, the tribunal are not going to be able to say, well, we would have done it this way. We think that 10% would have been fairer. They're not going to get down to that sort of level. As long as you've complied with the main sort of features of that, you should be okay, I would suggest. Place the business specific, as we mentioned, no allocation across sites. I would also include in this the timing of it, because I know that smoothing of tips across a period of time is quite common, but that's not going to be allowed. You have to pay it out at the end of the next month, as we said before. Slight thought about using third-party troncs. If there's a request for a tipping record, that request has to go to the employer, so presumably they'll need to then ask the tronc provider to provide the records to them so they can answer the request. It may be that the workers make the request directly to the tronc operator. It's a little bit unclear to me. There will be increased costs and compliance, and as Ian said at the beginning, it's not the ideal time in the industry for this to come in because of the massively increased costs, etc. But certainly the compliance burden is there. Businesses are going to need to think about this and how to put the systems in place. But there is a positive. I do think it's an opportunity to strengthen the messaging to staff on, we pass on 100% of tips always. That kind of message. We are a good employer. And it's a good time to sort of think about that positive messaging about reward and recognition of your workers. Okay, I think that's probably everything that I want to say at the moment. So now I'll pass over to Mason, who's going to talk.
Before you do, Lee, and that was fantastic. Blimey, there's more questions buzzing around my head now. That I've heard the details. It's fantastic. Thank you very much. We have had one question. I'll just put that to you now before we move on to Mason. And just a reminder to everybody, if you want to ask a question, just pop it in the chat and then we'll get to it at the end. But someone's asked the question, if a worker gets an individual cash tip, would they need to split this with the other workers? I guess that depends if it's under the employer's control. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. So if allowed to keep the tip, anything.
Sorry, Lee, we missed a little bit there at the beginning.
Oh, did you? Sorry. Okay. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Sure.
So the legislation only applies to two things: employer received tips and worker received tips where the employer exercises that control over it. So if there's no control, if the workers are allowed to split, keep the tip themselves, then they're outside of the legislation, so they can keep it. If, however, and sorry to sort of go on with it, but if what the employer does in practice is collect the tips at the end of the shift as a tip jar, a physical tip jar or something, and if the employer has any role in kind of separating it out, dividing it out, which I suspect they might do if there's a tip jar, then that will make it within the legislation. So okay, I think that's the distinction.
That's really, really useful. Thanks very much, Lee. Let's move on now to Mason, because Mason, you've got all the answers, I guess, have you? How we're going to manage this? Jason, I think you're on mute.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep, brilliant.
Good. I'll just share my screen. Can you guys see that okay? Good. So yeah, not necessarily all the answers, but just a quick interlude to follow on for some practical examples on how I guess people in the industry can solve these very real problems. Obviously, you've mentioned about agency workers leave previously, and loads of other factors considering the new laws that are coming into place. But just a quick overview about us as a business. So we are a cashless tipping and trunk platform. Obviously, Lee mentioned we do have a cashless tipping arm to the business where we can essentially allow workers to directly receive tips from customers with no employer involvement at all. But first and foremost, we are what we would call a modernized trunk platform. Now, you'll probably be asking, what does that mean? If you think of the traditional method of trunk, where you're downloading reports, sending them off to an accountant or a third-party provider, they're taking a couple of days to turn that information around and it's coming back to you, you're feeding that information and it's going out through payroll. What we do essentially is we, I guess, delve a little bit deeper into the business, understand exactly what your requirements are, and in essence, we just use tech to modernize that whole process. Now, when I talk about modernization, I mean through integrations, so how the business is set up and how we mainly operate with providers, whether it be a restaurant, bar, cafe, hotel, hair salon even, is integrating directly into the point of sale or the EPOS system or a PMS if you are a hotel. So we're essentially getting real-time data from a place of business relating to tips and service charges that are collected. We're also then doing the same with a rota provider, a HR payroll provider, and we're essentially then pulling through automatically hours worked, starters and leavers data, title, shift type, anything that is going to have an impact on that level of trunk calculation. So ultimately, like you'll see on the presentation slide, we can automate that process in the back end through the use of API integrations, CSV file uploads, to give you as employers a complete hands-off approach when it comes to this sort of process. So like I mentioned, leveraging tech to automate that in the back end. The second piece of the puzzle, or the second and arguably the most important piece, because hospitality mainly it's a people business, and making sure that you are attracting and retaining great talent, I think, is at the forefront of everyone's mind. Obviously, aside of what's going on in the economy, making sure that you've got the best team possible, that are providing the best service and the best culture and place for the rest of the team to work. Allowing team members to have that level of enhanced transparency. And again, it's a very hot topic that we've seen arise over the last couple of months or year or so, especially since the legislation has come into place. Ultimately, giving employers a people-first initiative to implement into their business that is going to provide enhanced transparency for team members on their trunk earnings. So again, if I go back to the traditional method of trunk, team members are experiencing shift latency, potentially experiencing shift latency. They're getting one line in payroll for having worked a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks potentially. I know that a 4 or 5 split is quite common for hospitality operators. We're working with businesses essentially to enhance that process, boost team engagement, boost retention, and ultimately making sure that you're keeping your team engaged. So they've got the ability through our platform to be able to log in on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis and check their earning. And when I say check their earning, what I mean is you'll be able to see from that brief example on the screen, they've got their own profile, they can see their own earning in a granular level or a granular detail. So you can see how many hours they've worked, how much they've earned per hour, what they've earned on a daily or weekly basis. Now, again, most of you will probably be thinking, well, if you are giving transparency on a daily basis, what happens if we're not doing the sign off till the end of the week? This is all the thing that we go through usually with the business that we start working with to understand how often is this process finalized, how often is it signed off? Because then, again, as I'm sure you can appreciate, pushing data out to individuals that is subject to change at a later date is going to be more hassle than it's worth. So really every business that we work with is on a custom basis, on a custom solution. We know that no one business in hospitality is the same. So again, it's really understanding how can we get the most out of your team members in terms of engagement and motivation, which longer term is going to act as a retention tool. And ultimately, what are the main pain points that you as a business are experiencing? You know, it's an interesting point that Lee raised about 5-10 minutes ago around the specification on place of business. You know, this is again amongst the agency staff element. It's probably one of the most common questions we get asked is, how on earth am I going to track the different areas of people working in different regions or different sites if you are a multi-site operator who've got multiple sites in one specific region? Ultimately, how we solve that problem, for example, is if you've got individuals clocking in and out on your rotoring system, they will essentially be able to earn pro rata amounts for each place of business that they're working at. So ultimately, again, it's sort of thinking about that scenario, what happens in real life, what is the problem, and then how can we use tech as an enabler for that? Again, I'd sort of emphasize hospitality is a people first business, is a people business. We don't want technology to blur the lines for that. We want that to act as an enabler to help make operators' lives easier, but also then help retain great talent, not just within the business, but also within the industry as well. Make it a valued place for people to work, or help towards doing so. And that's that second piece, really talking about that customization, is promoting transparency and also allowing businesses to monitor that level of performance. We're seeing a lot of businesses now introduce ways, or wanting to introduce ways, in which they can further enhance the motivation of team members using Tronc. So looking at interesting ways of how we can integrate into training platforms, how we can integrate into other elements to use Tronc as an enabler to enhance motivation. Obviously, there's a very clear line that we need to make sure that we're adhering to from a compliance perspective. But ultimately, as long as there is a clear and standardized message across the board, this is objective, and that has also been consulted with by the team members, then we can look to add that level of customization into every level of business. I think the big piece from my perspective as well, or our perspective as a business, is from the legislation is transparency. And you'll probably hear me harp on and on about how we can provide that level of transparency, how we can provide real-time learning updates to individuals. Not only that, but providing a one-stop shop for businesses to take that level of, I guess, administrative cost and burden away from them. Allowing individuals to log into a platform to see the Tronc policy that's available. Obviously, that is now a requirement moving forwards for every business to hold that, making sure that they've got complete and utter understanding of how things are distributed, when they're going to get the money, and all the other relevant pieces of information. So that's just a bit about us as a business, really. And again, I'll sort of hand back over to you guys for any potential questions.
Mason, thanks very much. That was really concise but really useful oversight of what a Tronc is and how it works, and how I like particularly your points about retention and team building. And I've got a question actually around this. It might be you, Lee, that might answer this, but obviously the employer's got to have a policy and an approach. Okay, so that's something that they've got to think about. Do they have to consult the staff on developing that approach?
Good question. The code of practice says yes, it would be good. It would certainly be good practice to consult staff about it. And in fact, in the questions, quite a decent percentage already do. There's like sort of 50-odd% where the workers on shift say yes, we've been consulted about how we want tips and service charges to be dealt with. So it's kind of anecdotally, or at least in the survey, it has been going on. But I do think under the sort of code, it's a bit more strengthened, that message. I think it's a good idea to consult staff on this type of thing. It feeds into Mason's point about keeping good staff and retention, because I think people who fall out of love with the tipping platform, or fall out of love with the way the employer's dealing with things, they don't feel involved, it's very easy for them to move on.
Yeah, no, that's really useful, Lee, and good to know. We do have a question from the audience, and it's about agency provisions. Would they potentially include a cleaner coming in from outside of operating hours? So if a cleaner comes in after operating hours, are they included?
Shall I venture a view on that one?
Yeah, sure.
I think I think it would be unusual because I think most people working in the industry, they would expect people who are on the service, contributing to the service and, working in the service, whether that's in the kitchens or in the front of house or, meeting and greeting, whatever else that might be, would be included. A cleaner who then comes to the site, they might be coming to the place of business, as we mentioned, but that would be part of an sort of ancillary sort of service afterwards, potentially. So I don't think, I mean, if you want to, but there's certainly nothing stopping you in the legislation to include, a wider group of people. But I think, most people would perhaps say that that's the employer's a separate service to the actual service itself.
Okay.
I guess there's also, I guess there's potentially two ways of looking at that though as well, isn't there? And I guess this is ultimately where the further clarification could potentially come from, is that, if you do have people coming in outside of, standard service, the same rules apply to people that are contributing from a central business operation standpoint. You've got customer service representatives, you've got sales and marketing. And again, there's, I completely agree, there are two ways of looking at it. And I guess I do agree with yourself, Lee, there's two ways, but it's always interesting to look at both sides, I think.
And I think sorry, Lee, I think the point you made about levels of pay. So, the central business team, Mason, I imagine, well paid or better paid. A cleaner, probably would benefit from the tips.
Yeah, and that could be a factor that, that some employers do decide to include these sort of other people who are ultimately would argue or would say that they are contributing to the service in that way. You've got people on shift who will maybe just literally clear the dishes and wash them and everything else, and they would be included usually. So it's an extension to the cleaning, perhaps.
I've got a practical application that might test you. So I phone up my local takeaway and pay on my card, and it arrives. But when the delivery driver arrives, I put a £5 in the hand.
Lost you there, Ian, sorry.
I think
I know where
Ian's going with this question, which I think is probably the takeaway, where you order it and the person turns up and, as you say, you give them a £5. Ultimately, it's whether that's included in the legislation. And I think
it's also a policy piece as well, isn't it? If it's written into the policy and it's said, we're not handling cash tips, and there's no, employer involvement like you mentioned previously, Lee, then it's potentially to that particular individual to deal with their own declarations.
Yeah, absolutely. It might well be the best way to sort of have to say, well, that's in our mind, that's outside of the legislation because the drivers earn that tip, and they're given the £5 when they arrive, and we're satisfied it's kind of theirs to keep. We're not going to get involved with administering that.
Yeah, you're back in.
No, not back. So yeah, it's interesting because you've got all. I do think the legislation will kind of encourage businesses to take a new look at this and sort of think, well, actually, what is fair and who should benefit from these things. Okay. So
do you want to do a bit of a roundup, Lee? Then I'm guessing, because I don't know whether we're going to get Ian back, just to, I guess, a roundup on the whole legislation piece. I know that we're sort of nearing. I think we've just passed over the end time anyway.
Yeah, so I think the main sort of headline really for today, I think, is this is still coming. It's now going to be pushed back though a little bit to the 1st of October. The Code of Practice does say that we encourage employers to actually start complying now. So you don't have to wait until the 1st of October. You can start to comply now. Change your systems. Make sure you've got a way of easily tracking, the monies that are coming in and being paid out. I think one of the key messages not concern, but the key messages I have is employers' ability to respond to those tipping record requests that I mentioned. I do think they're going to be quite onerous potentially. And let's face it, there is often a passionate debate sometimes amongst workers about how much they think they should get. So is it going to encourage lots of, discussions and potentially disputes about this? I hope not. I hope it's, with clear policies in place, I think we should be able to move away from that.
And I think as well that the initial piece of
watch this space.
Yeah, the initial piece of setting up a trunk or consulting on that, if you are making sure that you're doing your job and your efforts to make sure that it is fair, and the team members themselves are consulted on understanding what they think is right for the business, that's obviously going to minimise risk of things going to tribunal at a later date. So yeah, that's just another piece.
Yeah.
Sorry guys, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I had problems with my audio there for a minute. Apologies that I missed the last 5 minutes or so. There was a question I had, Lee, about transparency. So we talked about transparency for the employees. I'm just wondering whether there's a market mechanism here for customers as well, because people are discerning these days, and if they think they're going into a place that shares the tips fairly, it may be a competitive advantage. So I'm just wondering, there's nothing in the Act that talks about informing customers as well, is there, about the tips policy?
That's a really good point, isn't it? Because we've been speaking entirely about the employees and the workers, but you're quite right. Often customers are quite concerned about what's happening to their money. Does it all go to the staff? So the Code of Practice mentions that, but it says nothing it says exactly what you said. There's no legal requirement to inform customers, but I think it would be a good practice too, wouldn't it? To sort of, you don't have to demonstrate, you don't have to put your tipping policy in front of them in all its detail, but you can certainly put a message to say that we comply with the Allocation of Tips Act and 100% of the service charges goes to our workers.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the 11% that didn't currently pass on tips. Really important to know that. I also wondered about enforcement, and I guess you've touched on that, because it's employment tribunal routes, isn't it? We're not going to have something like a naughty list that's published about national minimum wage every year, are we?
No, we're not going to have a naughty list, but I think we'll still have Instagram and Facebook and everything else, and journalists on the case. Journalists love these kind of stories, so I think these things tend to police themselves a little bit. And who wants to be on the receiving end of those kind of headlines?
No, absolutely, no one does. And just finally, I've got lots of questions. The national minimum wage, 11.44, and real living wage. Does the Act say anything about tips contributing to those levels of payment?
Well, we've already got legislation that prevents employers using tips and service charges to contribute towards the national minimum wage element to it. So that's been in place for quite a few years now. So that's been outlawed for a while. Nothing specific about the real living wage, but I would certainly say that it would be very likely to contravene the Act when you're not allowed to use tips in that kind of unfair way, and it should be passed on. I think the idea is it's passed on as an addition to wages rather than constituting any element of wages.
Wonderful. But no more questions in the chat. So, Mason, is there a final thought you want to leave everyone with?
I think again, I'm harping on about the same point. I think it's the fairness and transparency piece. We see it time and time again where you speak to a business and with all the best intents and purposes, you can have a fantastic trunk system or what appears to be a fantastic trunk system, but if it's not communicated correctly to team members, if you're not providing that data to them on a regular basis, ultimately the fear of the unknown is then going to kick in, and people are then going to think they're not being treated fairly. They think there's opportunity for further improvements, when in fact there has been a hell of a lot of work that's gone in the background from the senior leadership team to implement something like this. So I think, again, Lee raised a point, and I think it was whilst you were sort of off mic, is that there's a real opportunity here for businesses to sort of double down on making sure that their employees feel valued, making sure that they're being communicated to correctly, and ultimately, for businesses, giving them the information that they so badly need. If you look at every other aspect of hospitality, you know, rotoring systems have come a heck of a long way. You know, EPOS systems have come on a heck of a long way. I think in a digital era where people generally, but again, a vast percentage of hospitality, people working in hospitality, are used to checking things on the phone and understanding where they're at with things on a daily basis. You know, there's apps for everything now. Giving them an easy way to check a way to know where they are with their earning, because tipping is money. Money talks, and tips are such an emotive topic, and they are, I think, such an important part of working in hospitality. So it's really trying to look for ways to further incentivize team members, but then also from a customer standpoint as well, even though it's not a legal requirement for this new legislation, showing customers and boasting about the fact that we are a business that cares about our employees. We work with this business to ensure that we're providing this level of service. And you know, if you are leaving a tip in a restaurant or a hotel or a cafe or wherever, making sure that your employees are feeling empowered about the tips that they're receiving. So I think just looping back to that very long-winded answer to the question is that level of transparency and updates for team members.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Mason. Lee, what about you? What's the lasting thought you would leave people with as they prepare for October the 1st?
I think two things really. I think the first thing is to start preparing now if you haven't already, because it's going to be here before you know it. And I do think come the 1st of October, people will be clued up about it. It'll be on the news, and you will have your workers complaining and potentially leaving your business if you haven't done anything about this, and you're not kind of you haven't got the systems in place. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is this tipping record. It's sort of slightly bugging me really for some reason. It's all the back of my mind, but I do think if it's used wrongly, it could really create a lot of compliance burden and hassle. So I think it's important to sort of to try and avoid being hit with a flurry of those requests. And the way to do that is to make things really transparent and clear, and to bring your workers along with you, so you're not kind of facing all these things.
Fantastic, Lee. Thank you very much. So there isn't much time really between now and October the 1st. The code of practice is out as of yesterday. I'm pretty sure we can send, if you haven't already seen it, we can send a link after the webinar to the code of practice so that everybody can have a good look at it. I think that hour has told me how complicated this can be. And thankful and grateful to you, Lee, and to you, Mason, to kind of steer us through some of the practicalities of implementing it. So thanks very much indeed for your time. I know you'll be there to help employers as and when they can, as and when you can, and when they reach out to you. So thanks very much, everyone. I hope it was useful. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks.